Okay, everybody. So the next organ we want to talk about in the endocrine system are the adrenal glands. And we already saw a portion of the adrenal gland when we did the autonomic nervous system, and we looked at the sympathetic pathway to stimulate the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. So here's the adrenal gland. Here's one of them. Remember, they sit on top of each kidney, but they're their own separate kidney, right? And the adrenal gland, we can separate it into two parts: the medulla, the middle portion, and the cortex, which are these layers, these three layers in the outer portion. And then it's covered by a capsule, like a connective tissue capsule. And so, like I mentioned, in the sympathetic division, we already looked at the adrenal medulla. This is the inner portion that's made of nerve tissue, right? And so remember that those nerve cells can secrete the catecholamines, that's a neurohormones, the epinephrine and norepinephrine. But for the endocrine system, the outer layers, the cortex, we said there were three layers to it. This is epithelial tissue. So these secrete hormones that go into the bloodstream. What the medulla secretes, the epinephrine and norepinephrine, are also hormones that go to the bloodstream. Those are neurohormones because it's nervous tissue that are making the hormones. In the adrenal cortex, it's the epithelial tissue. So you can see if we take a little cross section of the adrenal gland here, again, the very top layer, this is just a capsule of connective tissue. It just kind of separates the organ from the rest of the body. Then you have epithelial tissue, and the first layer is called the zona glomerulosa. The middle layer is called the zona fasciculata. And the inner layer, the one closest to the medulla, this is called the zona reticularis. And each zone, the epithelial cells are specialized to produce a different type of hormone. So those are written here, but I'm going to go to the next slide. There you go, to where you might see, you can kind of go around and see the different layers again, and then what hormones that they actually produce. So again, the outer layer just inside of the capsule is the zona glomerulosa, and that secretes the type of hormones that are referred to as mineralocorticoids, because they influence mineral balance. So specifically sodium and potassium balance. So mainly the one that we've already looked at was aldosterone. But remember, aldosterone gets secreted through the RAS system. So it's the kidney that, using the filtrate flowing through the nephron, remember that the cells are able to detect how much salt is in there. And if it's low salt, then the aldosterone will get stimulated to be released, but again, through that RAS system. Okay. The next layer are the glucocorticoids, right? And so that's from the zona fasciculata, kind of this light brown area here, tan area, right? So it's the glucocorticoids, and primarily what they release, the hormone it releases, is cortisol. So glucocorticoid is a classification of hormones, and cortisol is one of them, right? Mineralocorticoids is a classification, and aldosterone is the main one that we studied. Okay, so again, primarily cortisol, its major role is in glucose metabolism, as well as protein and lipid metabolism. And we're going to get a little bit more specific about that in just a minute. Okay, the most inner layer here, you can see the inner layer here right next to the medulla in the middle. So the inner layer, again, is the zona reticularis. And in the zona reticularis, that's where we secrete the sex hormones. And these are those that are identical or similar to those produced by the gonads, meaning the ovaries and the testes. And so it's there that we secrete estrogen and testosterone. Okay, so you do want to remember what each of the zones are and the primary hormones that they secrete. Okay, here's this one, says estrogen and testosterone. We've already gone through the medulla, the adrenal medulla, that's epinephrine and norepinephrine. There's also some peptide hormones that get secreted here. I'm not going to worry that you know those. Basically, if you can tell me, the zona glomerulosa secretes mainly aldosterone, that's a mineralocorticoid. The zona fasciculata secretes the glucocorticoids and mainly cortisol, and we're going to look at that feedback loop in just a minute. And then the androgens, or the zona reticularis, secrete the androgens, mainly testosterone and estrogens. And so again, maybe I should mention there, yeah, they're identical to what gets secreted by the ovaries and the testes, but this is where the other sex can secrete those hormones, right? So the testes make testosterone. Well, women don't have testes, so it's the adrenal gland that secretes testosterone. And vice versa, it's the ovaries that secrete estrogens. And so men don't have ovaries, so it's the adrenal gland that does that for men, right? So each sex does produce the quote unquote male or female hormone, but it will amount, and it's thanks to the adrenal glands that we do that. Right. So one thing also to remember is that all the adrenal cortical hormones, all of these from the cortex, they're derived from cholesterol, right? So that means that they're lipid soluble, they're lipophilic, right? And so, so these are the steroid hormones. They modulate gene expression. So again, they do, their receptors are inside of the cell, and especially they're inside of the nucleus. So they actually enter all the way into the cell where the receptors are located. Once they bind to a receptor, then that receptor has a secondary binding site, which binds to the DNA. And once it binds, then the DNA can get translated. It kind of turns on that specific gene. Okay, and even for even more control, sometimes these receptors, you need two of them to turn on a gene. That's why these are called half sites. So this receptor will bind here, and then another one will need another hormone to bind there. Okay, so just a little bit of extra control. So we would probably need a little bit more hormones building up in the blood before the DNA can be translated. Okay. So, so just a reminder, so in the adrenal glands, when we secrete aldosterone, the principal target cells are on the distal and the collecting tubules of the kidneys, right? Mostly the distal, but also the collecting tubules of the kidney. And so again, that secretion is activated by the kidney itself. It senses the low amount of sodium, and so it activates the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. All right, so here's that summary for you here. Make sure you know that sequence of events, the RAS system. Okay. It can be directly stimulated by a rise in plasma potassium concentration. So there can be a more direct stimulation depending if potassium gets too high. Because remember, when we get rid of potassium, we usually do that through sodium potassium pumps. So when we secrete potassium, we actually reabsorb more sodium. Okay, but mostly, again, the regulation of aldosterone is largely independent of the anterior pituitary in this case, because again, it happens through this system with the kidney. All right, the other part of the adrenal gland that releases cortisol, right? So cortisol, again, being released from the zona fasciculata, it's a glucocorticoid. The cortisol secretion, this is really important in carbohydrate, protein, and fat metabolism. Basically what it does is it helps people to resist stress. So the metabolic effect is to increase blood glucose, but at the expense of protein storage and fat storage. So what it does is it tends to stimulate protein degradation. So it breaks down muscles, right? Our muscles have a lot of protein in it. And so it breaks it down into amino acids. And what that does is it frees these amino acids to go to the liver and be available for a process called gluconeogenesis, right? So gluconeogenesis can happen in the liver, and it converts these non-carbohydrate sources like amino acids into carbohydrates. And so what it does is it inhibits glucose uptake by other cells, other tissues, but then it frees up this glucose for the brain. So the thing to remember here is that, remember when our cells make ATP, we primarily use glucose, right? But we talked a little bit about it. We didn't go through all the steps, but we did say if glucose isn't available, then the Krebs cycle can still work by breaking down using fatty acids or using amino acids. So this is where that happens. So what it does is it has our cells not use glucose, because we need to save the glucose for our brains, because our brains, our neurons, cannot make ATP with anything other than glucose for the most part. In extreme situations, they can start to metabolize ketones, but that's very extreme. That means you're in like the depths of starvation. But this is what stress is a stress response is doing. It means that the body's under stress. It's probably not getting fed well. This is how it started way back when we were cave people, right? The body wasn't being fed well. So you don't want the brain to shut down. So what you do is you protect all the stores of glucose so that the brain can use that, and then have the other organs other cells use fatty acids and amino acids, right? And then the liver, like I said, it stimulates hepatic gluconeogenesis. So that means that happens in the liver. So the liver then can take some of these amino acids from the protein breakdown and make it into carbon dioxide. Same with lipolysis. So lysis means to break something. Lipo is lipids, right? And so that means the target cells are the adipose tissue. Remember, adipose tissue is a big storage for fats. And so in lipolysis, you release fatty acids, the free fatty acids, to use as that alternative metabolic fuel instead of glucose, right? So again, then the glucose gets reserved for the brain. Okay. And so I put there, it plays a key role in adaptation to stress. So the reasons for stress are, they're still kind of unknown. So again, the speculation of how this evolved over time is, again, say like a wounded animal or a person, if your life is being threatened, then you may not eat, right? So without eating, cortisol then allows us to store other molecules for fuel. So again, that way the glucose is protected during periods of fasting. So if you couldn't get food, you would have glucose available for the brain. And then the body, but see, that's why the body starts to break down under extreme stress, because we're breaking down, excuse me, muscle and fat, right? So in today's world, our stress is not usually, because of starvation, but it's the same response. And so we go through the same thing. Again, I've mentioned this all throughout the semester. Our stress is the guy who cut us off driving. Today, our stress is a stressful election period. It's the pandemic, right? And that's not to say it's not important, but for the most part, in today's world, food can be available to us, right? But if you are stressed and you're not getting food, your body is going through a protective mode, right? But when food is available, it's still going into this mode. And that's why some people, you think, yeah, but when I'm stressed, I gain weight. Well, because you're saving the glucose and you're storing that, right? And so we're still eating while we're trying to store. So now the extra carbohydrate is being stored as fat. Okay, so it's a real subtle situation here. right? So basically, this is controlled by a negative feedback loop with the hypothalamus, right? So now we're back to our hypothalamus and pituitary gland control, right? So this has it really briefly here, and I put it a little more, what am I trying to say? Specifically here. So remember, it starts with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to release its releasing hormone that's called corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH. Again, the target cells for that is the anterior pituitary. So when the anterior pituitary receives that signal, remember it travels in the blood through the portal system, through the infundibulum, receives that signal, it causes the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropin hormone, ACTH. So ACTH targets the adrenal cortex, okay, targets the adrenal cortex, particularly in that zona fasciculata, right? And because it's in the zona fasciculata now where the adrenal cortex will release cortisol. So again, here are the effects of releasing cortisol. We increase the blood glucose, and that's because it's stimulating gluconeogenesis. It's inhibiting glucose uptake. So it's a little different process than insulin and glucagon, okay? It's that subtle difference. It's increasing blood amino acids. So now other cells, while they're not taking up glucose, then they're going to take up amino acids to make ATP. It increases the blood fatty acids. Again, most of the cells are not taking up glucose, but they are taking up fatty acids. Now the blood glucose that's there is available for the brain. Okay, but again, just like all our other feedback loops, as cortisol increases in the bloodstream, it then has a negative feedback on both the pituitary gland. So that means the pituitary gland will release less ACTH. It also acts on the hypothalamus, causing it to release less CRH, which will then, of course, release less ACTH. Okay, so again, make sure you can relay this pathway, the secretion of cortisol. And maybe the question is something like, what is the hormonal pathway and control system if you're under stress and we need to increase blood glucose levels, right? And so this would be the pathway that you describe. And again, it's showing that stress, it has a positive influence. Diurnal rhythms, just your daily rhythms of wake and sleep, also have an effect on this, a positive effect. So there are disorders. So aldosterone hypersecretion, again, a primary cause, there could be a tumor on the adrenal gland. Okay, and for aldosterone, then with hypersecretion, it's affecting the tumor, is affecting the aldosterone secreting cells, right? In that zona glomerulosa, right? And so then you get a hypersecretion of aldosterone. And it could, so that's if it's because of the adrenal gland itself. We call that hyperaldosteronism, or it's sometimes known as Conn syndrome. Okay, it could also be an inappropriately high activity of the renin-angiotensin system, the RAS system. But then we refer to that as secondary hyperaldosteronism. Okay, again, just remember, a primary cause is on the secreting gland itself. A secondary cause then is something that might be stimulating that secreting gland, but the secreting gland itself is okay. Okay, so of course, what happens if you have aldosterone hypersecretion? Well, you have excessive sodium retention. And remember, sodium can make the blood very hypertonic. So that would cause fluid to come from out of the interstitial fluid and get into the blood vessels, and that would make high blood pressure. Okay, that could, when we retain sodium, remember, because of sodium potassium pumps, we might over-secrete potassium, which means we're depleting potassium out of our blood. And that could really have effects on our nervous system, could cause a problem with that. All right. Another one, then, if there's cortisol hypersecretion, we refer to this as Cushing syndrome. So again, overstimulation of the adrenal cortex could be just because of excessive amounts of either CRH or ACTH. So if the hypothalamus is oversecreting CRH or the anterior pituitary is oversecreting ACTH, both of those then would be, it's like, again, you're screaming at the adrenal gland, release more cortisol, and they're doing it. Okay. A primary reason then would be the adrenal tumors. And so a tumor on the adrenal gland, again, might cause it to uncontrollably secrete cortisol, even independently of ACTH. Because remember, a cancerous tumor is usually an overproliferation of cells. So in this case, they're secreting too much cortisol, right? Other places, ACTH secreting tumors located in other places other than the pituitary gland. So you can have other cells and they erroneously secrete ACTH, but it has the same effect in the end. Okay, so with the signs and symptoms, hyperglycemia, glucosuria. So basically what you're getting here, remember, with oversecretion of cortisol, you would get excessive gluconeogenesis. So you would get too many amino acids converted to glucose. And then the body really suffers from combined of high blood glucose and then a protein shortage. And then this ends up mimicking diabetes. This is what they might call adrenal diabetes. That's what glucosuria is. It's extra glucose in the urine. Remember, a healthy kidney will reabsorb all the glucose that gets filtered. But in this case, again, you have excessive gluconeogenesis. So that means you're putting more glucose into the blood and less cells are uptaking the glucose because they're saving it for the brain. Right. So that's really mimicking diabetes, but it's not a diabetes coming from the lack of insulin or anything. So we call it adrenal diabetes. And then what happens is some of this extra glucose is deposited in the body as fat, like I was mentioning before, even rest. And so a lot of times what happens is the appendages remain thin because of a muscle breakdown. So these normal fat distributions, you might get a fatty lump on the kind of in between your scapula, and that's referred to as buffalo hump. Sometimes people store it in the face and they call it moon face. So here's a boy prior to the onset of the condition, and here he is only 4 months later, he's developed Cushing syndrome and he's got that characteristic moon face. So this is actually the same boy. But you can see deposits that are developing again because of the extra glucose in the blood. Okay, other disorders of adrenal cortical function. So adrenal cortical, adrenal cortical insufficiency. This is what's known as Addison's disease. That's if there's a primary, again, it's happening to the adrenal cortex itself. This is really when all of the layers of the adrenal cortex are under secreting, right? And so we refer to this as Addison's disease. So, but low aldosterone can be life-threatening because now we're going to lose too much salt, right? So sometimes an autoimmune disease can cause this. And so remember, with aldosterone deficiency, if we're not reabsorbing sodium, it means we're also not secreting potassium, and that's what hyperkalemia is. Hyperkalemia, too much. Hyperkalemia refers to potassium. So you get too much potassium in the blood. Hyponatremia, natremia refers to sodium in the blood, but hypo is low sodium in the blood. So again, usually when you have high of potassium, you have low sodium and vice versa. Okay. Again, if it's a cortisol deficiency, then It's a poor response to stress. You get hypoglycemia and lack of permissive action for many metabolic activities. Your overall metabolism can go down. Okay, a secondary action, a secondary cause of adrenal cortical insufficiency is, again, not the adrenal gland itself, but something else that affects the adrenal gland. So it could be because of pituitary gland abnormality, maybe a tumor or something, and it could be the hypothalamus. So that's hypothalamic or abnormality. Something's gone wrong with the nuclei in the hypothalamus, those clusters of cells, right? So again, if it ends up that ACTH becomes deficient, then therefore only cortisol is deficient. So it really kind of just depends. You can pinpoint, knowing these pathways, you can pinpoint what's wrong. Okay, so that's kind of the overview of the adrenal gland. Next one we want to go over is the endocrine control of growth. And this can get kind of complex because growth, it does depend on growth hormone, but it's also influenced by many, many other factors. So it's not only about growth hormone. So yes, if growth hormone is insufficient, then you might not get a normal growth pattern in a child. But these other factors come in too, independent of growth hormone. So genetic determination of an individual's maximum growth capacity. And you can kind of see that through descendants, through family members of how tall everybody is. You can almost guess that that person is also going to be tall. If you have a few short people in your family, then there's a possibility that the child gets those genes as well. Diet is very important in growth and other things like brain development and things like that. So having a healthy diet, not only before birth and then after birth, during critical points in the growth of the baby and then the child, having a healthy diet is super important to growth. Being free from chronic disease and stressful environmental conditions, because you saw that stress can actually affect our endocrine glands in several different ways. And again, there's going to be more hormones associated. We said thyroid hormone is also affects growth. Estrogen levels affect growth. Testosterone levels affect growth. So there's a lot of things that do, right? And that's the last bullet there, normal levels of growth influencing hormones. Okay, and so in a normal growth curve, you can see on the y-axis, this is percentage of total growth. So, right, this is, and then at birth, this is age from birth to age 20 years. So you can see right after birth, there's this growth spurt. So this is a period where proper nutrition is critical. Right. And then the growth kind of slows down, and then all of a sudden puberty hits. And so that's when our sex hormones kick in. And we'll look more at that when we do the reproductive system. But you'll get another growth spurt occurring. And the timing of this is a little bit different. It's a little bit earlier in girls and a little bit later in boys. Okay. Again, so what you're seeing here, it's not a continuous curve. Yeah, I think that's all I really wanted to say. I'll mention it here. I think what I was going to say, and I kind of stopped because I think I mentioned this in the reproductive system, but I'll do it again here. You know, I mentioned the growth spurt usually occurs a couple years before it occurs for boys. That's why, like, I remember in the 8th grade, I was the tallest girl in the class. You know, me and a couple of my friends, we were taller than even the boys, or maybe I should say 7th grade. And you'd pick on the boys, and then you'd have summer vacation, you wouldn't see each other. And then we came back at the first month of 8th grade, and the boys were all taller than us. And, oh no, and we picked on them, and we hoped they didn't remember. And they usually didn't, of course. All righty, so let's look at growth hormone. Okay, so growth hormone, it does partially follow the control of the hypothalamus. So let's in the hypothalamus, it will secrete growth hormone releasing hormone. Again, that travels through the infundibulum, through the portal system to the anterior pituitary. That causes the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. And then its target organ it can be the liver. So it primarily promotes growth indirectly by stimulating the liver's production of something called IGF-1. And that means insulin growth factor, or I'm sorry, insulin-like growth factor. Okay. It's a hormone that acts directly on bone and soft tissue for growth promoting actions. Okay, and then it stimulates protein synthesis, cell division, lengthening and thickening of bones. So that's why you see IGF on the muscle, on the bones, even on the soft tissues help, the adipose tissues and things. All that helps with growth as well. It mentions somatostatins, and what this does, they're structurally and functionally similar to insulin. And so that's why it's called insulin-like growth factor. So it just binds to receptor enzymes that activate a tyrosine kinase pathway. And so that's that cellular secondary messenger system inside of cells. Okay. It can also exert metabolic effects not related to growth. So it does, oh, I probably should have mentioned this here. It increases the fatty acid levels in the blood, right? So again, that's all going to help with releasing energy stores because growth takes a lot of energy. And it increases blood glucose levels as well. And again, all of that with growth, you need to stimulate energy. All righty. Don't worry about ghrelin. I'm not even going to mention it to you here. Don't worry about ghrelin. I want you to just stick with this pathway. Okay. So here we go. What if there's an overproduction of growth hormone in childhood before the epiphyseal plates close? So remember that in the bone, this bone kind of, yeah, this kind of shows it. Remember, there's that epiphyseal plate. It's that section of bone cells that are growing where we're still having that conversion of the cartilage into bone, right? And that's the growth area. That's where you can get lengthening of the bones, right? So that's what this means. So if there's overproduction of GH in childhood before those plates grow, then you just get this runaway growth and you get what's called gigantism. So here's kind of an average sized man, and this is one of the tallest men in the world. It also could, you could also have a tumor of growth hormone producing cells in the anterior pituitary. That could happen as well. But symptoms really depend on the age of the individual when the abnormal secretion begins. So again, with gigantism, you're getting an overproduction of GH in childhood before those plates grow, before those epiphyseal plates close. Here's one where you get, almost forgot to advance, this is called acromegaly. And so this is when the hypersecretion of growth hormone occurs after adolescence. So here you can see this boy at age 13, he's got normal growth patterns. So after adolescence, then the epiphyseal plates close, they stop growing, right? But now they're getting a surge of growth hormone. So what we tend to see then are, instead of the bones lengthening, they're becoming thicker, right? And soft tissues like connective tissues and skin really start to proliferate. So you might see, you're starting to see like the jawline thickening, the brow ridge is thickening on this young man. Hands and feet can become enlarged, toes and fingers become thickened, right? But this can actually, you can get peripheral nerve disorders, and that's because the nerves get trapped by the overgrown connective tissue or bone. Okay, so that's another hypersecretion of growth hormone, but after adolescence, right? Go back to this one. Here's the opposite. Here's hyposecretion of growth hormone as a child. And so that might cause dwarfism. So the bones and tissues aren't getting any stimulation to grow. And so the person is aging, but they're not getting any growth there. And so, so that's a type of dwarfism. Let's see. And usually that can be due to a pituitary defect or even a defect in the hypothalamus, some kind of malfunction in the hypothalamus, right? All right. And then, so again, I've mentioned this already, but I thought this little girl was cute. So growth itself, again, other hormones beside growth hormones is essential for normal growth. So like thyroid hormone is very important. Remember that helps enhance growth hormone. So growth can be severely stunted in hypothyroid children. So we see how important it is. If there's hypersecretion, though, it doesn't cause excessive growth. Kind of interesting. Insulin also important in growth because, again, growing tissues need to make energy to grow, right? So insulin, again, helps those tissues take in glucose. So deficiency also often blocks growth if you have a deficiency in insulin as a child. If you have too much insulin as a child, then that does often spur excessive growth. So it's not always just about growth hormone. And then, of course, the androgens are things like testosterone, the male hormones. So they play a crucial role in that growth spurt during puberty because they're stimulating protein synthesis in many of our organs. But its effects depend on the presence of growth hormones. So we have actions there where they're dependent on one another. And then estrogens also affect growth prior to when the bones are mature. But the effects of estrogen still aren't completely understood that well, right? So here's this little girl, though. She's ready to grow nice and strong and healthy and take over the world. Maybe she'll be president one day. I don't know how old this picture is. All right. Thank you, guys. That's it for the endocrine system. Hope you learned something.